At the age of 65 and beyond, many men begin to wonder how the world perceives them. The lines on their faces tell stories of decades lived, of battles fought, of victories celebrated, of losses endured. They carry within them a sense of maturity that cannot be fabricated by youth or replaced by the exuberance of vitality. Yet, in the quiet moments, some of these men ask themselves a question. Do I still carry any charm? Do women still notice me? What is fascinating, and often hidden beneath layers of psychology and social dynamics, is that charm does not fade with age. It transforms, and most men over 65 are completely unaware that the very essence of what younger women, and even women of similar age find attractive, is no longer tied to physical youth, but rather to something much deeper, more stable and profoundly psychological. This journey is about uncovering that hidden reason. It is about exploring the unconscious mechanisms at play, the invisible threads that shape attraction, and the unique magnetism men over 65 often carry without even realizing it. It is not about superficial seduction, nor about cliches that paint older men as merely experienced. It is about understanding the psychoanalytic truth of feminine perception, the deeper layers of why women, often unknowingly, respond to certain qualities in older men. Many men at 65 look at themselves in the mirror and see only the contrast with their younger selves. They notice the thinning hair, the slower body, the wrinkles where smoothness once lived. In their mind, the magnetism of youth has been lost, and with it, the supposed source of admiration. But this is a mistake rooted in a cultural obsession with physical vitality. Women, especially when viewed through the lens of psychoanalysis, do not perceive charm in such a one-dimensional way. What the male gaze often defines as attraction is incomplete. For women, especially those seeking emotional resonance, maturity often becomes the hidden core of fascination. The unconscious, as Freud highlighted, does not operate on the same rational logic of conscious awareness. Desire is shaped by early impressions, unresolved complexes, symbolic projections, and emotional safety. In other words, women don't simply choose to be drawn to older men. Part of it is a psychological echo, a resonance that bypasses logic and touches memory, fantasy, and unconscious needs. One of the strongest elements that creates charm in men past 65 is stability. But not stability in the financial sense alone, although that may play a role, but stability of presence. A man who has lived decades acquires a rhythm that cannot be rushed. His words are often slower, but also more deliberate. His reactions are measured, his silences more meaningful. For many women, especially younger ones navigating a chaotic world of uncertainty, this presence becomes magnetic. It represents safety. In psychoanalytic terms, it evokes a return to the archetype of the protector, a symbolic figure rooted in the unconscious mind that associates maturity with refuge. Women may not consciously say that they are drawn to him because he represents safety, but the unconscious registers it. A smile may appear, a softness in the eyes, a subtle change in tone when speaking with him. These are the unconscious manifestations of attraction to stability. Another dimension of charm that men over 65 often don't realize they carry is non-neediness. Younger men, often in their 20s or 30s, sometimes vibrate with a hunger to prove themselves, to compete, to dominate, to conquer. This energy, while powerful, can also feel heavy, exhausting, or even threatening. Older men, having lived through triumphs and disappointments, no longer carry the same desperate urge. Their identity is already established. They do not need to win approval at every step. This lack of hunger translates paradoxically into confidence. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this is deeply appealing. The female unconscious, conditioned by centuries of symbolic roles, registers non-neediness as strength. It does not read desperation. It reads self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency has always been coded as a sign of power. Thus, when a younger woman smiles at a man in his mid-60s or 70s, she may not even understand why. But deep inside, her unconscious is responding to a vibration of calm confidence. A man who is not grasping, but simply being. One of the most controversial but undeniable elements of psychoanalysis is the father archetype. Freud's Oedipal theories, though debated, criticized, and reinterpreted, laid the foundation for understanding how parental figures shape attraction. For many women, the father figure imprints the first model of masculine presence. As women grow, the unconscious may seek echoes of this figure, not in the literal sense, but symbolically. the man who embodies wisdom, authority, protection, and patience. Men over 65 often align unconsciously with this archetype, even if they never intend to. This does not mean that women desire their fathers. Rather, it means that the unconscious is always searching for familiarity. An older man may project that familiarity through his demeanor, his tone of voice, or his calm assurance. Younger women, without articulating it, may smile at such men because something deep within recognizes the presence of a symbolic father archetype. Charm is not always about what is seen, it is also about what is felt. Energy, as Jung suggested, is not merely mystical but psychological. The collective unconscious is influenced by archetypes, but the personal unconscious resonates with unspoken energies. Men over 65 radiate an energy of lived experience. Their pace, their stories, their ability to listen without rushing, all of this creates an aura of gravitas. And this energy often bypasses the rational defenses of women's minds, reaching instead into the unconscious. This is why a woman may later wonder why she smiled at him, why she felt at ease in his presence. She may not find a logical answer, because it wasn't logic that acted. It was her unconscious responding to the energy of a man who carries decades of experience. Another hidden reason behind the charm of men in this stage of life is the authority they unconsciously radiate through time itself. Time shapes presence. A man who has lived through revolutions, crises, and cultural shifts carries a symbolic weight. Even if he is unaware of it, when he speaks, the authority of time speaks with him. Women, whether consciously or unconsciously, register this. It is not just about wisdom. It is about depth. A younger man can read about history, but an older man has lived it. This difference is not visible at first glance, but it is deeply felt. In psychoanalysis, this authority of time aligns with what Jung called the wise old man archetype, a figure of knowledge, intuition, and guidance. Women unconsciously recognize this archetype and may find themselves drawn to it, even if all they outwardly show is a small smile. One of the great paradoxes of aging is that as men grow older, they often stop pretending. In their youth, they may have tried to be what society expected, to impress bosses, to impress friends, to impress women. But by 65, many men simply become authentic. They speak their mind without the same fear of judgment. They laugh freely. They embrace eccentricities. They do not chase trends, but instead embody their truth. For women, this authenticity is intoxicating. Why? Because authenticity signals emotional safety. A man who is real, who no longer wears masks, who is comfortable in his own skin, creates a space where a woman feels she can also be real. This is profoundly attractive at the unconscious level. Women may smile at older men not because they are flawless, but because their flaws are worn openly. And openness creates connection. Another secret behind the magnetism of men 65 and beyond is detachment. Unlike the anxious energy of youth, detachment radiates calm. A man who no longer fears rejection, who no longer measures his worth by external approval, becomes paradoxically more attractive. From a psychoanalytic lens, this detachment resonates with the unconscious desire for freedom. Women, especially in a world where they feel constantly evaluated, judged, and pressured, find in an older man's detachment a kind of liberation. His presence says, "You don't have to prove anything to me." And in that freedom, attraction is born. At this point, we can already see that the charm of men past 65 is not about superficial looks or outdated stereotypes. It is rooted in deep psychological structures: the archetype of stability, the father figure, the authority of time, the authenticity of self, the calm of detachment. And the irony is this: most men past 65 don't know they carry these qualities. They underestimate themselves because they are looking at the mirror of youth. They forget that women's unconscious perception is not the same as a magazine cover, but something much more profound. The truth is that smiles from women, whether younger or older, often hide unconscious recognition of these deeper traits. And if only men understood, they would realize that the charm they thought was gone has only transformed into something more powerful. As we continue to explore the hidden reason behind the charm that men over 65 carry, it becomes clear that what truly shapes attraction at this stage of life is not an effort, but a natural unfolding of lived experience. The qualities that once needed to be cultivated or even forced now exist as second nature. This shift is not consciously noticed by these men, yet it is silently felt by women who encounter them. When a woman responds with a smile, It is rarely about the superficial detail of a shirt or hairstyle. It is about an unspoken recognition of qualities that cannot be manufactured in youth. Consider the way a man over 65 listens. In a world where conversations are often rushed, dominated by interruptions, or driven by the need to assert opinions, his ability to simply remain still and allow someone to speak becomes extraordinary. Younger women, who often experience conversations with men their age as competitions or performances, may find a kind of unexpected peace in the attentive silence of an older man. Without saying a word, his listening becomes a mirror, one that validates her thoughts and emotions. Psychoanalytically, this represents more than politeness. It signals the presence of the archetype of the witness, someone who offers the unconscious permission to exist without judgment. Women may not articulate it this way, but their unconscious mind interprets it as a form of acceptance, and that acceptance is powerfully attractive. There is also the matter of storytelling. Men over 65 carry with them decades of narratives, experiences of a world that has shifted dramatically over time. Their recollections of historical events, cultural revolutions, personal struggles, and journeys often weave a sense of depth into conversation. When a woman hears a story told by a man who lived through a time she only read about in books or saw in films, her unconscious registers a bridge between imagination and reality. It is as though his presence connects her to something larger than herself, to history itself. In the unconscious, this translates into a symbolic association with wisdom. And wisdom, far from being a dry or academic trait, is intimately tied to security, guidance, and the allure of mentorship. Attraction often arises not from beauty or strength, but from the feeling of being guided into deeper understanding. Another dimension often overlooked is patience. In youth, impatience drives many decisions. It fuels ambition, but also creates restlessness. Men in their 60s and 70s, however, tend to have cultivated patience not through conscious training, but through the simple rhythm of life. Losses, recoveries, successes, and failures have carved into them an ability to wait, to endure, to see beyond the urgency of the moment. For women, this patience manifests as emotional steadiness. The unconscious perceives it as a safe harbor. A man who does not rush her decisions, who does not demand instant answers, who carries within him the calm of patience, awakens a sense of freedom. In that freedom, attraction blossoms. It is not the attraction of desire alone, but the deeper attraction of emotional sanctuary. The charm of older men is also tied to the subtle transformation of masculinity itself. In younger years, masculinity often expresses itself in competition, in conquest, in loud demonstrations of strength. With age, masculinity becomes quieter but no less powerful. It shifts into presence rather than assertion, into influence rather than domination. This quieter masculinity carries a paradoxical force. Women may feel drawn to it precisely because it is not shouted but whispered. The unconscious, weary of the constant noise of superficial displays, finds peace in this silent confidence. It is a magnetism that does not need to announce itself. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this magnetism is closely tied to what Jung described as the anima and animus dynamics, the interplay of masculine and feminine energies within each individual. An older man who has reached a certain maturity often integrates parts of his own anima, his inner feminine qualities, such as sensitivity, empathy, and intuition. This integration creates balance, and women unconsciously recognize it. They sense not only the masculine protector or guide, but also the softer, receptive qualities that allow for emotional resonance. When these energies balance, the unconscious response is often one of attraction, as though the psyche itself recognizes wholeness. It is also worth noting the impact of resilience. A man who has lived through decades has inevitably faced hardship. He may have experienced illness, loss, heartbreak, or professional challenges. Yet the fact that he continues to walk, to laugh, to share, communicates resilience. For women, resilience is profoundly attractive because it suggests durability. In psychoanalytic language, resilience signals an ego that has endured crises without disintegration. The unconscious reads this as safety. A resilient man is not fragile. He will not collapse under pressure. This stability becomes deeply alluring to women seeking reliability in a chaotic world. We must also examine humor. Humor at 65 or 70 is different from humor at 25. It is not driven by the need to impress or shock, but by the ability to find lightness in the ordinary, to laugh at oneself, to see irony in life's twists. This type of humor carries authenticity. It is not performance. It is survival. Women often find this kind of humor irresistible because it radiates acceptance of imperfection. Laughter shared with an older man can feel like an embrace, a moment of intimacy that bypasses logic and enters the realm of emotional bonding. In the unconscious, humor is linked to play, and play is linked to eros, the energy of life itself. Thus, even a small joke or a warm chuckle can carry the weight of deep attraction. Another invisible quality that shapes the charm of men over 65 is the slowing of time around them. When a man of this age enters a room or engages in conversation, the pace subtly shifts. His lack of rush, his slower gestures, his calm voice, all alter the rhythm of interaction. Women unconsciously respond to this as a kind of grounding. In a fast, overstimulated world, the ability to slow down is magnetic. It evokes the archetype of the wise elder, someone who transcends the frenzy of daily life. A smile in response to such presence is often a signal of unconscious gratitude for the stillness he brings. Sexuality, too, takes on a different meaning at this stage of life. While many men fear that aging diminishes sexual appeal, the truth is that sexuality becomes less about performance and more about intimacy. Women, particularly when viewed through the psychoanalytic lens, often respond to the intimacy of presence rather than the vigor of youth. An older man who approaches with tenderness rather than urgency awakens in women the unconscious memory of what genuine closeness feels like. This intimacy is not rushed, not forced, but steady and attentive. It is in this shift from performance to presence that the true charm of older men resides. We must also recognize the unconscious association of survival with attraction. Evolutionary psychology, though distinct from psychoanalysis, intersects with it in many ways. A man who has survived into his 60s and 70s unconsciously signals strong genetic and psychological endurance. For women, even those who are not consciously seeking partners, the unconscious reads survival as strength. A man who continues to stand tall after decades of life becomes a symbol of continuity, and continuity is attractive. The smile that appears in the presence of such a man may be the unconscious acknowledging this endurance. There is another layer, subtle but essential. Older men often embody forgiveness, not necessarily in dramatic declarations, but in their approach to life. Having lived long enough, they have forgiven others, forgiven themselves, and learned to move forward. Women sense this energy of forgiveness as openness. It suggests that the man is not imprisoned by bitterness. For the female unconscious, this represents emotional safety, the assurance that intimacy will not be poisoned by unresolved resentment. At the same time, there is a profound allure in the acceptance of mortality. Men over 65 are closer to the horizon of life. They know, even if unspoken, that time is finite. Far from diminishing their charm, this awareness creates depth. Women unconsciously perceive in them a seriousness that is not heavy but real, a reminder that life is precious. In psychoanalytic terms, this acceptance of mortality integrates the shadow, the part of the psyche that acknowledges the inevitability of death. By embracing it, older men radiate authenticity and courage. The unconscious in women responds with admiration, and admiration often flowers into attraction. In all of these ways, men over 65 unknowingly project a unique form of magnetism. They do not chase it, they do not seek to manipulate it, and often they do not even believe it exists. Yet it is present, woven into the unconscious responses of women who encounter them. A smile exchanged on the street, a warm glance in conversation, a subtle change in tone, all these are small but significant expressions of attraction rooted in psychoanalysis. And the irony remains, the men themselves rarely realize the reason behind these gestures. They underestimate the invisible power of their presence. There is a paradox that defines the charm of men over 65. They often believe their attractiveness has diminished, when in reality it has shifted into a deeper register, one that resonates not with superficiality, but with the unconscious layers of human psychology. Women who encounter these men may not consciously describe the source of their smile or their admiration, yet something inside them reacts instinctively, almost as if drawn to a hidden current of energy. The older man is often puzzled, even dismissive of this reaction, unable to recognize that his presence alone carries a weight that time has crafted. In many ways, this unrecognized charm is tied to the aura of mystery that surrounds a man at this age. He has lived long enough to know that not every question has an answer, and not every answer needs to be spoken. This quiet acceptance of ambiguity itself becomes magnetic. Younger generations often crave certainty, but certainty can be suffocating. Ambiguity, when held with confidence, radiates wisdom. A man who is comfortable with not knowing everything, with admitting limits, unconsciously signals emotional maturity. For women, this honesty becomes disarming. It invites trust, and trust is the foundation of attraction. There is also an element of scarcity. Men who reach their mid-60s and beyond often become less common in the social landscape of dating or emotional exchange. For younger women, the very rarity of older male presence creates curiosity. It is not that women consciously seek them out, but the unconscious mind is attuned to what is scarce, to what stands apart from the crowd. In psychoanalytic terms, scarcity often amplifies desire. The less accessible something appears, the more attractive it becomes. The older man embodies this paradox: available yet uncommon, ordinary yet unique. A smile cast in his direction may be the unconscious acknowledgement of this singularity. Another dimension is ritual. By the time a man has lived into his 60s and 70s, he has usually cultivated small rituals: morning walks, the way he prepares coffee, the rhythm of his evenings. These rituals, often unnoticed by him, create an aura of order and stability. Women who sense these patterns unconsciously connect them with predictability and grounding. Rituals, in the psychoanalytic sense, serve as anchors for the unconscious. They provide continuity in a fragmented world. A man who carries rituals without even speaking of them radiates an energy of discipline and balance, qualities the unconscious mind of a woman interprets as strength. We must also reflect on the impact of dignity. Aging carries challenges. The body slows, health issues appear, and the vitality of youth fades. Yet, when a man meets these changes with dignity rather than despair, he projects an extraordinary form of charm. Dignity is not denial, nor is it arrogance. It is acceptance with grace. Women sense this quality in the smallest gestures: the way he stands, the way he carries himself, the way he interacts with others. Dignity is one of the most profound attractors because it communicates mastery over the self. The unconscious reads it as integrity, and integrity is irresistibly appealing. Even silence itself becomes a source of attraction. Younger men often fear silence in conversation, rushing to fill every gap with words. Older men, however, often carry silence as if it were a companion. They know that not every moment must be filled, that stillness can speak louder than chatter. Women who experience this silence may find it unnerving at first, but soon they recognize it as comforting. The unconscious translates silence into confidence. A man who is not afraid of quiet is a man who is not afraid of himself. This quiet courage is unconsciously seductive, drawing others closer. There is a subtle yet powerful influence in the way older men perceive time. Having lived through decades, they understand that moments are fleeting, that life passes quickly, and that the present is precious. This awareness seeps into the way they interact. Their appreciation for small details, their savoring of simple pleasures, their slower pace all convey to women a sense of being valued in the moment. When an older man looks into a woman's eyes and truly sees her, without distraction, the unconscious registers this presence as devotion. Devotion, even when silent, becomes a profound form of attraction. Another hidden quality is generosity. Not only financial generosity, though that can play a role, but generosity of spirit. Men who have lived long enough often realize that life is not about accumulation, but about giving. They offer attention, advice, humor, and presence without expectation. Women unconsciously interpret this generosity as abundance. It suggests that the man's internal world is full, that he does not operate from scarcity. Attraction flourishes in the presence of abundance because abundance promises emotional nourishment. The unconscious responds with warmth, translating into gestures of affection, sometimes as simple as a smile that lingers. Men at this age often embody reconciliation with imperfection. They no longer chase perfection in themselves or others. This reconciliation is magnetic because it liberates those around them from the exhausting demand to perform. Women feel this freedom deeply, even if they cannot explain it. The unconscious associates it with acceptance. When a woman feels accepted for who she is, without conditions, she is naturally drawn to the source of that acceptance. This is why men who radiate ease with imperfection often find themselves admired without knowing why. One cannot overlook the role of subtle sensuality. Youth often equates sensuality with intensity, with passion expressed loudly. In later years, sensuality becomes softer, quieter, almost imperceptible. It appears in the way an older man touches an arm gently, in the way he pauses before speaking, in the warmth of his laughter. This subtle sensuality is powerful precisely because it is understated. The unconscious perceives it not as performance, but as authenticity. Women, particularly younger ones accustomed to overt displays, may feel unexpectedly drawn to this softer expression. It is a reminder that sensuality is not about force, but about presence. We must also acknowledge the unconscious projection of legacy. Older men embody the passage of time, the connection to ancestors, to history, to continuity. Women may unconsciously perceive in them a bridge between past and present. This projection of legacy is not about status or achievement, but about being part of a larger story. A man who represents continuity awakens in women an unconscious longing for belonging. Even if she is not seeking partnership, her unconscious recognizes the comfort of being connected to something enduring. This recognition often surfaces in subtle admiration, expressed in gestures as simple as a smile or prolonged eye contact. Another element deeply tied to psychoanalysis is the reconciliation with vulnerability. Men in their later years have often shed the armor of invulnerability that youth demands. They acknowledge pain, they speak of fears, they admit uncertainty. Far from weakening their image, this honesty strengthens it. Women who encounter such vulnerability often feel moved. The unconscious perceives vulnerability not as fragility, but as humanity. Humanity is magnetic. When a man allows himself to be vulnerable, he creates space for authentic connection. The unconscious responds with trust, and trust is the soil where attraction grows. Older men also project a kind of timeless masculinity. They are no longer bound by trends of fashion or social media displays of success. Their masculinity is not about proving themselves, but about embodying presence. This timeless quality, detached from the noise of modern validation, becomes magnetic in its simplicity. Women unconsciously admire what feels unshakable, what seems immune to the fluctuations of external approval. This timeless masculinity is often the reason why women feel drawn to men much older than themselves, even if they cannot rationalize it. In addition, we must reflect on the unconscious association with mentorship. Men who have lived through decades often carry the aura of guidance. Whether or not they actively mentor, their presence suggests they could. For women, especially younger ones, this guidance resonates at the unconscious level as safety, as direction, as wisdom. Attraction is not always about romance. It is often about the unconscious seeking guidance. A smile given to an older man may be the unconscious expression of gratitude for the guidance his presence symbolizes. There is also a profound magnetism in the way older men face solitude. At 65 and beyond, many men have learned to live alone, to find peace in solitude rather than fear it. This relationship with solitude radiates strength. Women unconsciously perceive it as independence, as proof that he does not rely on others for validation. Independence is alluring because it promises freedom rather than entrapment. The unconscious responds to solitude embraced with a recognition of strength, and strength always carries the seeds of attraction. As all these layers unfold, the great irony remains. Men over 65 rarely recognize their own charm. They believe the admiration of women belongs to their past, not realizing that their magnetism has evolved into something far more profound. It is not the fleeting charm of physical youth, but the enduring charm of psychological depth. The unconscious of women responds to this depth instinctively, even when their conscious mind cannot explain why. A smile, a glance, a moment of softness, all these are signs of recognition. The truth is that the real reason behind the charm of men over 65 is not one single trait, but the integration of many. It is the way stability merges with patience, how wisdom merges with humor, how dignity merges with vulnerability. It is the authenticity of presence, the authority of time, the subtle sensuality of slowing down, the generosity of spirit, and the acceptance of imperfection. Together, these elements form a constellation of unconscious signals that women respond to with warmth, admiration, and attraction. When men at this age finally recognize this, their perception of themselves changes. They no longer see aging as decline, but as transformation. They begin to carry themselves differently, with more quiet confidence, with more openness. And when they do, the smiles they receive from women no longer confuse them. Instead, they understand that those smiles are acknowledgments of a charm deeper than youth could ever offer. The psychoanalytic truth is that attraction is never only about the surface. It is about the unconscious, about echoes of archetypes, about the symbolic weight of presence, about the subtle dance between memory, desire, and recognition. Men over 65 embody these truths whether they know it or not. And that is why women smile at them, why they are drawn to them, why their charm endures even when they themselves believe it has faded.